We have a special offer for our faithful listeners. The promo code podcast20 takes 20% off the tuition for some of our e-learning online courses. The course lineup includes classics by Kenneth D. King, Pamela Leggett, and other trusted sewing instructors. You can count on Threads for expertise in these on-demand learning experiences. Learn at your own pace anytime you want to log in. Check out the course lineup at threadsmagazine.com/e-learning, and don't forget to apply the code podcast20 for your 20% discount.
Hello and welcome to Sewing with Threads, the monthly podcast with the staff of Threads Magazine. I'm your host, Carol Frazier, and I'm joined today by this month's guest, Maggie Raywood. Maggie joined the NYU Design Department faculty in 1992. Employed in the professional theater since 1975, she's been a draper and costume shop manager on Broadway shows, opera, and dance in New York costume shops, as well as regional and international theaters. For 9 summers, Maggie has designed costumes for NYU's program of summer performances at Villa La Pietra in Florence, Italy. At Villa La Pietra, Maggie is also engaged in research into the collection of early 20th century Callot Soeurs gowns housed in the Acton collection. She wrote about that project for the fall 2023 issue of Threads, on newsstands now. There was so much to that story, Maggie, that didn't make it into the printed article, and I am very eager to talk to you a little bit more about it. So welcome to the podcast.
Thank you so much, Carol. It's such a pleasure to be here.
Well, the first thing I want to ask you is, what is the Acton collection and how did you get involved in it?
So the Acton collection is actually a house museum that's in Florence. Hortense Mitchell Acton, who was an American and was married to an Englishman, Arthur Acton, at the beginning of the 20th century, fell in love with Florence and bought the Villa La Pietra, which is a Renaissance villa on the northern hills of Florence. They lived there really basically the rest of their lives, except for a brief sojourn during World War II where they had to flee Florence because that obviously Florence had been overtaken. And in fact, that area was very much an area that was being sort of commandeered by the Nazi troops. So they had to flee for a while, but other than that, they spent the rest of their lives in Florence. They raised 2 sons there. Sir Harold Acton was the last remaining family member, and he bequeathed the house to New York University. I taught at NYU for almost 30 years, and at a certain point in about 2011, 2012, a very dear friend and colleague who teaches in the grad acting department, I taught in the design department, which is theatrical and film design. And my colleague, Jim Calder, was teaching a class and directing some things at Villa La Pietra. And he said, when are you going to come to Florence? And in 2013, I said, how about now? So I started going there really to work with Jim and to work with students who were studying with him, as well as professional actors who I'd known also as students. While I was there, I was introduced to the collection by my dean, who happened to be visiting, and said, do you know about these clothes? The entire villa is a house museum. They were great collectors. They were passionate art collectors. They were extremely knowledgeable. They traveled the world. They had a very strong interest in the arts and of Asia, particularly of China. They traveled in China a number of times. Sir Harold actually lived in China for many years. So you see in the house, in the museum, an enormous influence of Chinese and other Asian decorative arts. It's also full of incredibly beautiful paintings, extraordinary tapestries, some of which are hundreds of years old. So it's quite a unique collection. In the midst of all of this, a painting conservator in 2004 opened a trunk, a Louis Vuitton trunk, that was in Hortense's little trunk room off of her bathroom. And inside were these dresses, all folded very neatly, and a number of pairs of exquisite shoes from the 20s and the 30s that no one knew were there. And we still to this day do not know how they got packed away, who packed them away, why this particular group of clothes. But in among the 30-odd dresses that were there, 21 of the dresses are all from the house of Callot Soeurs. So it's an amazing collection because they span a couple of decades. So you see the progression of Callot's work from the earliest dress, which is somewhere in 1907 to 1908. We know that it's definitely no earlier than 07, but no later than 08, because it's the dress that Hortense was wearing when Julius Rollschoven painted her. And that portrait hangs in the entryway to the villa. So in that pink dress, which is one of the dresses that I've now been documenting and researching, we know exactly when that's from. And then there are other dresses that stretch into the late 20s, and one that's probably actually just about 1930. It's the whole story of it is so compelling to all of us, the conservators, the museum staff, myself as a costume maker and researcher. It's so interesting because she clearly had a very strong affection for this house. They really, they were obviously one of her favorite couturiers, and she had at least these 21 dresses. There may have been more that don't exist, that were lost or sold or given away or whatever. We don't really know where, for instance, we don't know what some of the occasions were. And we only have, I believe, 3 images of her in any of these garments. There's the painting of her in the pink dress. There's a photograph of her in this very clearly party dress from the late teens, probably just getting very close to 1920. There is another photograph of her, a series of photographs of her in a dress from 1909, and we have the date on the photograph, so we know when that's from. And there's one other dress that, in looking at photographs in the collection, I realized is actually a photo of her wearing a linen dress, a very simple early 20s linen dress that is also in the collection. And that's another one that I'm hoping that I will get a chance to document. But the other 3 that we have already, that we've seen her wear, are 3 of the dresses that I've already worked on. To date, I've actually patterned 10 of the dresses in the collection. So
you want to tell us a little bit more about that project, about the pattern making and what your goals are and how you do it?
So it's been interesting because it has really, it's grown and it's changed over the years. When I first had the idea of doing the project, I approached the director, at the time was a woman named Ellen Toscano, and I asked Ellen how she would feel about me patterning and photographing, documenting the dresses. And then in talking to Francesca Baldri, who is the collections manager, and the 2 conservators, Costanza Perrone de Zara and Claudia Bayer, whose company Restauro Tessile is responsible for all of the conservation work at the villa, I talked to them about doing the project, and they were super excited about it. And I had 3 goals in mind when I started. One was that as a pattern maker myself, this was really interesting to me. I love those first couple decades of the 20th century. That changes from year to year are so interesting. There's so much radical change in women's clothing at that time that I find it really fascinating, culturally as well as a dressmaker. Also teaching at NYU, and my graduate students were really, I wanted them to have the opportunity to, if not see these dresses in person, to at least be able to access the research and the pattern making, and to actually work with them on some of them, which I actually did assign one of the dresses once as a project. And lastly, I wanted all of the information that I was collecting, the pattern, all of the documentation, the notes that I was taking, the photographs. Each dress I've taken well over 100 photographs, most of which are like the corner of the sleeve, that kind of thing. I wanted the kind of detail work that you don't often get to see when you're trying to make a historical garment. And these were the details that I wanted to really capture in what I was offering also to them as a contribution to the archive. So that was the idea. I also thought, well, I'll make a full-scale model and a half-scale in muslin. Just, we'll be able to use it. Maybe we'll have somebody wear it at some point in like a sort of salon kind of setting. I did that the first year with 2 dresses and realized it was an unrealistic amount of work and project. And the other thing was that it's not a huge space where their textile lab. And sometimes they'll have an enormous tapestry in there that they're working on, that's something from the Uffizi that they're doing their restoration work on. There's just not room for me to start adding 20 more dresses. So I switched to just working in half scale, but changing it to half scales that were not just in muslin, but were in fabrics that would at least give you the sensibility. I do not refer to these as recreations. I think that is not my goal. I'm not trying to recreate these incredibly beautiful things in half scale, because that would be, frankly, madness. But also, the goal for me was that I wanted a way to connect the dresses with people who are either studying them, who can't necessarily handle them up close, or to explain to visitors how these dresses function, because many of the dresses are strong enough to put on mannequins and to display, but you can't do it for long, and you have to be extremely careful, and the conservators there are just remarkable. I've learned so much working with them. They're extraordinary. And this was a way, I thought, sort of in a tactile way, to really be able to connect people to these dresses, explain what they were. Just the fact that when you say to a student, and I've talked to students now about the project, you say to a student who, is 20 or 22 years old, you couldn't get in and out of this dress on your own. They're completely mystified by that idea. That's like, because there we all are wearing stuff you can pull on over your head, and, you're lucky if it has buttons, much less anything else. So this idea of dresses that were layer upon layer upon layer and have so many closures. I mean, this hooks and then that lays over and that hooks and then this goes around here and this snaps and then there's this other thing. So it just goes on and on and on. Now, as a theatrical dressmaker, I'm actually used to that. I've made many, 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 many period costumes in my career, which has been a lengthy one. And I've had the opportunity to actually handle a lot of vintage clothes, some of my own collections, some at NYU, some at the Costume Institute at the Metropolitan Museum, and other museums as well where I've done research. So the idea of a costume or a piece of clothing that has, 37 hooks and half a dozen snaps and all kinds of different means of getting in there, because it was all about hiding the closures. It's about the mystery of the dress. It's not, zip up the back. So that idea doesn't throw me. I'm used to it. So I think that's another way that my own background actually fits in quite well with this, with the ability to actually understand the logic of these dresses. And the logic of clothing is something that I find a very interesting concept of how each period of time has its own logic in terms of the way the clothes function, because they're fulfilling a certain aesthetic goal or a practical goal or whatever. But there's a logic to clothes, and when you start to work in period after period after period, you start to realize there's things that you expect to see when you look at how a dress opens. It doesn't surprise me that there's an underbodice that closes in the different place than the skirt closes. This for me is normal. But I do think that when you're trying to explain clothing to people who have not had that experience or who have not worn those clothes or examined those clothes, these are things that are surprises to them, but hopefully in getting to look at them, they're surprises that make them interested in the way clothing is made and how it functions and how it expresses a time period, how it expresses the life of that woman. Just the idea that I know, looking at these clothes, that she had to have help getting in and out of them tells you what kind of person we're talking about in terms of her place in society. And a lot of these clothes are pretty glamorous. And so this is clearly, these are not the day clothes, except for this one linen dress that I think is a day dress. Almost everything in this collection is extremely opulent. And of course, that is part of the calling card of Callot as a house. They were known for these extraordinarily beautiful, luxurious, fabulous clothes that I think are really indicative of both the style of the time, the taste of the woman, and the taste of the house, and what they were able to do.
So as a little bit of a spoiler for the people who are going to see your article, the focus there is on some of the slightly earlier gowns, and they're just dreamy. I mean, they really are amazing. And, they have that ability to be quite harmonious all over, but every little square inch is interesting and beautiful, which is, that's the mark of an artist to me, that it all comes together so nicely. But I'd love to know, how what are the dresses? What are the later dresses like? Can you explain how Hortense's fashion sense changed along with the designers?
So, of course, the shapes start to become much simpler. Her color sense, she starts to move into maybe some darker tones, but then I'm thinking of this white beaded 20s dress that's actually on display right this minute in the villa. That's an amazing garment. And I'm thinking about the fact that she was in her late 50s when she was wearing this 20s flapper dress with these sort of petals that hang down, and it's like very jazz age. So I was thinking, oh, maybe they get a little darker. I thought, nah, maybe not so much. She was bold, and I think pretty fearless in terms of the way she dressed. Now, again, clearly these garments are evening and dinner dresses, things like that. But so you do see, for instance, and there's a 20s dress that is this deep orange red velvet that has sections of the velvet at the bottom. It's just an early 20s tunic, but it's got 12-inch silk fringe, and at the bottom of it, parts of the velvet have been trapuntoed with these little flower shapes. So it's all tone on tone. It's all the same color, but the texture changes. Then there's this movement of the fringe. Everything is swooped to the front, kind of right in front of the abdomen. There's this sort of kind of swoop of fabric where everything drapes from there. It's just one color, but it's just, every time I see this dress, it just absolutely blows my mind. It's probably not one I will pattern. We've focused my work on the things that are really starting to struggle in terms of their condition. And interestingly enough, one of the things that I found most interesting, even though I've handled a lot of period clothes of many, many different periods, and so part of this was I kind of knew in the back of my mind, but seeing so many garments, I was struck with how many garments were extremely good shape on the outside. The outer silks were, even the chiffons and laces, in beautiful condition. They're also being beautifully, beautifully cared for. But they've really held up beautifully. But the inside inner bodices on many of them are just shattering. And this turns out to be metal salts that were used to make these fabrics, way more so that they could be sold by the pound they would charge more money for them. So those metal salts have started to degrade those taffetas that are the inside. So one of the things that we also hope, and this is again kind of a little afterthought, it wasn't what we started by thinking, but having my patterns now, if we needed to make an inner structure, we would never remove anything. For one thing, you could never figure out how to put these back together if you started taking away the inside. But if we needed to support the dress in order to be able to display it, there is now a pattern for an inner bodice that could kind of slip in as a frame, as an armature in a way, to help hold the dress up. So that is been interesting to see that's one of the things that has been, I think, useful as we go forward about having the patterns. But it's why we've also concentrated on a lot of the earlier dresses that really need some conservation work or some documentation before it's too late. Whereas the 20 stuff is in fabulous shape.
Well, so is there any way, I was going to ask about this, is there any way to stop this deterioration at this point? Or
no,
you just try not to handle it? And
Yes, because the deterioration of the silk is because the silk, before it was even made into a garment, was bathed in these metal salts, and it just has contributed to the fabric falling apart. There's sadly nothing that you can do. They have certain conservation techniques where they can add a layer of something that is does not affect the chemical balance of the fabrics, and this is stuff they understand really well. But I have not. I've not done that myself, and so when I'm there and working on one of these dresses, it's a little nerve-wracking because I'm trying to not make it worse. So I'm super, super careful, and they are around. If I have to turn the dress over, for instance, I don't do that on my own. I always have Costanza or Claudia.
Well, so I was going to ask you, because most of us, when we're, if I'm trying to make a pattern out of a garment, I'm stretching it and pinning it down and going over it and manipulating it and pulling it apart, pressing it, and all those things. And that's just a one-layer garment.
Yes.
What are you doing? I'd love to have a picture of what you're doing.
So what I'm actually doing is working section by section, and I'm actually with a tape measure and making notes. So I'll sit with my notebook, for instance, and I will, let me find a good one that I could hold up maybe. And I will actually draft certain things. Sometimes, actually this little piece of a skirt is drafted in scale, but it's in 1/4 inch scale. So I will draft certain things right away, or I'll make a drawing of a panel. This is a velvet panel on one of the skirts on a 1909 dress, and I just make tons and tons of notes and measurements and try to remember to measure everything so I don't actually forget that one measurement, and I get back to the States and go, what? Wait a minute. What is the distance from the waist? Like, what was I thinking? So I try to be really careful because it's really annoying when you forget something. But so I really try to be very systematic. I start at the top of the dress and I go work my way down. I do all one side, then I flip the dress over, do the other side. The really hard part is when you have to go inside the dress, because now you're really talking about this, how you fold things, how you lift things, what I photograph. Can I get my hand into something where I can take a measurement? This is where having the experience that I've had comes into comes into play and is useful. I understand how a dart is shaped on a skirt yoke, because I've made 1,000 of them. But so I don't have to necessarily be able to open something up or unpick something, because I can figure out by looking at the grain, by the amount of fold that there is at the top of the dart. I can figure out the drafting because I have enough experience as a dressmaker, as a pattern maker, to be able to make certain logical leaps. And that is very helpful, because I don't know that I could do that. Just even, for instance, understanding how an underbodice works, and that side front panel is always, in this period, is always going to be cut on the bias, and in her dresses it always is. So knowing that, having that as a base, is helpful with a dress that's as complicated as these are. So I work entirely with a tape measure and with a pencil and a ruler, and the ruler nowhere near the dress because I can't risk catching the corner. But it's true, it's actually one of the things that is tricky. I've certainly made patterns out of period garments where it's something I bought in a flea market, and I've made basting lines through a piece on the grain so that I'm sure that I'm getting the grain right on my pattern. But obviously I can't do that to these. So photographs really help, especially with some of the fabrics, because the grain is quite clear. And that's always a good way to just double check when I'm actually drafting what I'm looking at. So the drafting takes about 3 days per dress, just to sit with the dress. And I would say that I actually sit with the dress for a while and start to look at it and make notes before I measure anything, because I'm trying to think about the dress overall and what would sit where and how would it close and where is it fitting on her body. And so I don't even actually start by measuring. I actually start by looking and literally sitting sometimes with the dress for an hour or two and just examining it, thinking about it, trying to observe details that I might overlook if I weren't really paying attention. There's a beautiful bow on the front of one of the dresses that is in blue silk. It's a little bow, that big. It took me 20 minutes to figure out one day how they bound the edges of the silk, because I thought, oh yeah, they bound the edge. And I thought, well, no, but there's this double fold and they bound it. How did they do that? So I eventually figured it out, but I would have missed it completely if I hadn't just allowed myself some time to just sit and observe and look at it. And I think that's one of the things that's been both a joy of this project and interesting for me as a pattern maker, is that these assumptions that I would make, oh, it's a bow, it's got 6 loops, it's a bound edge. Oh, okay, I know what this is. But they did things that were just a little bit more special, a little bit more careful, in ways that I don't always expect, but that I love seeing. You talk about the shapes. One of the things that's interesting to me about looking at these dresses, even as early as the 1909 dress, is you're starting to see how things become more angular. And this is a combination of moving into the teens and later into the 20s, but it's also the influence of the kimono, of Asian styles of dress, of Middle Eastern styles of dress. And Marie Callot Gerber who was the premier in the studio, in the Callot atelier. She was fascinated by all these other styles of dress and styles of cut. And I think it shows in some of the choices that she makes about how something is going to be draped. There's things that you think are the chiffon dress from 1909 I thought for sure it was a series of gored panels because that's mostly what everybody was doing, until I looked at the dress and I realized it was a square and she'd lopped off one corner and turned it on the bias. And it floored me, which doesn't seem like it should be that big a deal, but when you come to certain assumptions based on your experience, and then somebody shows you something that's so simple but so completely different than what anybody else was doing, you step back. That was a moment for me looking at that skirt. I just was like, what was she thinking? And it's probably my favorite dress, actually.
Okay, I was going to ask you, what was your favorite dress? Is that the blue one?
It's the blue one. It's
Okay.
the blue chiffon. It's the blue chiffon one that has sort of a batwing sleeve.
Yeah.
Because there's so many surprises in that dress, and that skirt is the big surprise. But even that batwing sleeve, which is sort of a collar and sort of a sleeve and then sort of something else, and then you put it on, and you put it all together, and you realize, oh, she's just draped a kimono, you see it when you see the dress. You suddenly realize she's looked at these Japanese prints, and she understands how those sleeves were drawn together by the time the obi goes around, and she's clearly absorbing it. And I don't know, obviously wasn't in her mind. I don't know how much of it was, ooh, I want to do that, or just that the influence had settled in her somewhere as an artist, that she was taking all these things that she was looking at and expressing them in a way that was appropriate to her time and her place and her materials.
I would say that sometimes I sometimes get that feeling, and I think a lot of our listeners and readers probably are familiar with that from looking at clothes by V&A. And it's worth saying V&A was one of their students, or worked in their atelier.
No, she was one of their premier stitchers. She was one of the dressmakers for 6 years, and I think something that V&A credits them. There's that famous quote about, I would have continued to make Fords, but because of the Callots, I learned to make Rolls Royces. And when I look at the V&A dresses, and I've made quite a number of them out of Betty Kirk's magnificent V&A book, which I'm sure many of your readers have or have looked at, but it's now, having looked at some of these Callot dresses, now she was gone, V&A was gone by the time some of these dresses are made. But I'm looking at V&A and I'm looking at some of this Callot stuff and thinking, there's something going on. There's something bubbling there beneath the surface in all of these artists at that time. And I think there's elements of this that V&A certainly took into her own work, because that ability to work with geometry in a unique and exciting way, it was certainly new at the time. We forget how new it was to be so angular, to be so bold, to start to come away from the corseted shape and all of that, to shift the profile so much in women's clothing, just to shorten the hem 8 inches, to suddenly have a dress that's below your calf instead of not dragging on the floor, is revolutionary. So I just think there's a connection there that I feel is probably really, really real in terms of what V&A observed, what she took, and then, of course, she was a genius in her own right, and so she goes on to do what she does, and so brilliantly. So,
I know it's. In both cases, because I've looked a bit at the pattern drawings that you've shared for the Callot gowns and some V&A ones, and it's not just. The geometry is amazing, but then it's making it work with fabric that is almost liquid. and or that is very stiff. If you're using taffeta, that's much stiffer, to understand that how your fabric is going to work with these geometric shapes that you've made and where the grain line goes. And there are so many moving parts.
So many moving parts. And it is. And you see how much Marie especially, really depended upon understanding the body. These are not patterns that you could just draft. These are patterns that are so dependent upon the figure, the body, and her whole opinion was that the dress should suit the woman. You don't make the woman match the dress; you make the dress match the woman, and it shows. It shows. The first time I looked at the pink dress, it happened to be on a mannequin, and the way that it's shaped in the back, there are these beautiful little darts that are all shaped over the upper hip in the back. That's not drafting. That's absolutely the hand of a draper making something that was almost molded to Hortense's figure, and it's very clear. It's not something that you could have just decided to do from a draft. For one thing, every single one of them is curved, so they're curved darts in silk file. So I was like, oh, okay. And they did a lot of handwork, but they did also use a sewing machine. It's not every seam is sewn by hand, even though I know, generally speaking, couturier, we think of all of the work as being handwork, but the dresses, they absolutely employed a sewing machine. They were not unwilling to do that. And some of the dresses have magnificently beautiful finishing, and some look like they were a little faster. I have this image, which is totally made up, this is my theatrical training of, making a story to go with the dress, that things that Mrs. Acton decided she needed at, semi last minute. And they were like, crank. Let's, oh my God, let's make this green dress. She's wearing it for a party next week. I don't know. That's just that's my theatrical costumer imagination, but it's certainly not outside the realm of possibilities. So it's just interesting to look at to think about what the possible storylines of some of these dresses, like what we don't know what events she wore them for. The blue and gold dress that is kind of Egyptian, kind of Persian, a little Japanese kimono, it's kind of a little bit of everything. I look at this dress and think, what was this event? And then think about, again, talking about context, thinking about her walking down. There's, in the villa, when you walk in the main entrance, you're in a rotunda, and there's a curved marble staircase descending from the second floor. And she made her entrance coming down those stairs, because you couldn't not. It's just there. It's so beautiful. And when you see right now this exhibit that's at the museum is about the house, the idea of living in the house in the 20s and the 30s. And so there's a lot of objects around there, paintings that William did, objects that belong to Sir Harold, and objects that belong to the whole family, and some of Hortense's dresses, these are things all from the 20s and late 20s. And to see them, the lighting is all still the original lighting, and just the quality of the light against the bugle beads and the sequins, and the way it all just sparkles in this little glimmery way, like fireflies. It's just...
That is a wonderful picture. Maggie, we are coming to the end of our time, and so I'm going to have to say goodbye. And thank you so much for telling us all about this. This is fascinating. I hope
Well, thank you
people
for having me.
get their chance to get to Florence and visit the villa. Hopefully, there will be some dresses there, and maybe we'll see some more of your half scales at some point, and learn more about what you're finding out with all of these gowns.
Thank you for having me. I really appreciate the time.
Thanks so much.
My pleasure. Thank you. Bye.
Thank you to our guest for joining us, and thanks to all of you for listening. Please remember to send your comments, questions, and suggestions to th@taunton.com. And please like, comment, and subscribe wherever you're listening. It helps others find our podcast. Until next time, keep on sewing with threads.